So first, let me do the introduction of the talk. Then we'll wait for Professor Vernon Smith. Let me first do the introduction. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zhuo Xi. I'm a global strategist and a research fellow at the Hainan Green Finance Research Institute. This is the third episode of our Green Development International Seminar Series, where we will invite international experts and industry leaders to share their insights related to sustainable finance and economics. Today's seminar is called Classical Theory of Human Action in Society and Markets, Adam Smith's Models for Socio-Economic. It's a main talk by Professor Vernon Smith. First, let me introduce our main speaker, Professor Vernon Smith. Professor Smith is widely considered as a founding father of experimental economics. He was awarded Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics. Currently, he's a professor at the Economic Science Institute of Champion University. Today, Professor Smith will use his results and method from experimental economics to analyze and compare different models for socioeconomy. The presentation will take about 40 to 45 minutes. That's the first part. Then we will have a discussion session. After Professor Smith's talk, we will welcome Professor Ding Yifan and Professor Chew SooHong join the discussion. Professor Ding is the chair of the academic committee at the Hainan Green Finance Research Institute and vice president at Chinese Society for World Economics. Professor Ding is widely considered as one of the top economists in China in the field of international economics, political economics, and international relations. He will make comment and discussion and join the discussion. Then we will also have Professor Chew SooHong. Professor Chew is a professor at Southwestern University of Finance and Economics and a fellow of Econometrics Society. He is one of the leading economists in the area of behavior economics and behavior finance. He has a lot of influential work in this field. The two experts will make comments and share their insights regarding Professor Smith's talk. The discussion part may take about 30 to 35 minutes. Finally, we will have a Q&A session. In this session, you can raise your hand in Zoom. There's a little button in the Zoom, or you can just write in the chat box. We will pick some questions. That's pretty much the structure of the talk. Right now, we are still waiting for Professor Vernon Smith. Let me see if his office is responding. That should be the time. Okay, since we are still waiting for Professor Vernon Smith, and we can have now at the moment we can have Professor Ding Yifan or Professor Chew to talk about their insights or their research related to behavior finance or economics in general. Professor Ding or Professor Chew, do you want to have a talk first?
I'm good with Professor Dean starting the session, I guess.
Okay.
So I can say a few words about current situation in global economy. So I'd like to remind you that Professor Rubini, Professor Chew, to some extent, from New York University, Professor Rubini just made a very, very interesting paper saying that Biden administration is turning to a sort of a neo-populist economic policy. The neo-populist economic policy is a total shift from the traditional economic policy conducted under successive American administration from Bill Clinton through George Bush, Barack Obama, and then all these American administration all implemented somehow a neoliberal economic policy. Well, starting from Donald Trump, the U.S. government is shifted its economic policy from neoliberal policy towards a neo-populist policy. While the Biden administration seems to continue on this road, and these kind of a neo-populist policy represented some characteristics, some new risks, and maybe some logic between neoliberalism and neo-populism. That's something very important because it implies a new orientation of American government policies, and that new American government policies will have a broad impact, broad implications on global economy, because the U.S. government is no longer interested in keeping the U.S. dollar strong. Well, if the U.S. government is no longer interested in keeping the U.S. dollar strong, with a weakening U.S. dollar, that will trigger inflationary pressure on the commodity market. Well, because the U.S. dollar remains the sole and predominant pricing currency of the commodity market. So when the dollar is weakening, the subsequent consequences of the dollar's weakening is a rise in commodities prices. While commodity prices rises, it will exert a global inflationary pressure on every country. And that will force other countries to adapt and to adopt new monetary policies to adapt to the new situation. And that could broad economic policy consequences on the United States, on Europe, but also on China. So we have to follow this new development trend closely and to adapt Chinese economic policies in accordance to this new situation. That's something new.
Thank you, Professor Ding. Yeah, I saw that article as well from Professor Rubini. Yeah, very. Professor Chew, do you want to have a talk or presentation of your research about your finance at the time we're waiting for Professor Smith?
I can do that.
Yeah, you can share your screen or.
Okay. Let me see.
While we're waiting, yeah, no problem.
How can I share the screen without? I'll just try this first, okay? I don't know whether it will work properly or not. Okay, the talk actually jives rather well, I think, with the host institution, the Hainan Green Finance Research Institute. These two bullet points are very much from Vernon's slides, which I got a copy. So he talks about Wealth of Nation, 1776, Adam Smith having modeled price formation from the perspective and experience of a self-interested buyer and sellers in the market. And I added as a comment that that perspective did not leave much room for other regarding behavior as articulated in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment. So both points are kind of amply exposited by Vernon in his slides, which we expect to hear fairly soon. And he also mentioned his work, his pioneering work about how markets actually work, and in a sort of tested in a laboratory setting in his 1962 paper. And his talk also covers what he calls an implicit model of price discovery in the Wealth of Nations. So those of us who are exposed to let's call it the modern view of how the market work, certainly have benefited from Smith's actually extended works since 1962, many of which were co-authored with, for example, Charlie Plott. So interestingly, the same Adam Smith was responsible for two relatively distinct strands of thinking. The moral sentiment, underpins regard for others, and Wealth of Nation largely, I would not say dispense with that or moral sentiment, but largely shows that markets can function without requiring players to be very involved in that sense, without requiring players to be engaged in altruistic behavior. So here I'm going to mention, interestingly, two familiar names: one Milton Friedman, and the Henry Ford. So what Milton Friedman writes seems very Friedman-ish. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. It also echoes Wealth of Nations, profits, wealth. At the same time, Henry Ford, who actually did make a lot of wealth for the US economy, for the world economy, I guess, and he's also a philanthropist, very green. So he said, a business that makes nothing but money is a poor kind of business. So back to our host institution, Green Finance. Why consider ESG investing? I don't think we need to spend time on this one, okay? ESG is socially responsible. It also encompasses moral sentiment and other regarding behavior. In particular, the American Association of Individual Investors, describe socially responsible stocks as integrating social and ethical consideration, and so on, respecting human rights. So a bundle of, shall we say, positive qualities that may appeal to many in the investing public, even if MBA schools had not traditionally taught students to be particularly other regarding or socially responsible when investing. So here is just a bit of stylized facts. Since stocks tend to outperform the market, on the surface, it sounds like an anomaly. Wow, sin pays. Perhaps we can appreciate that if people are averse to something, then that thing would need to be more appealing for you to engage in it. So perhaps since stocks need to deliver somewhat of an excess return before they get really considered in the average investor's portfolio. So this is in itself suggestive that perhaps investors have a heart. So have a heart, right? Have a, our kind of moral. Oh, that's good. So Vernon is starting.
Professor Vernon Smith is coming. Yeah. Professor Chew, can you make your talk after Professor Vernon Smith's talk?
I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
So much. Yeah.
Professor Vernon Smith, can you hear us? Professor Smith, we cannot hear you. Professor Smith, you need to unmute your microphone. We cannot hear you.
It is. Is that coming through?
Yeah, it's coming through.
Okay.
Yeah, we're very honored to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here.
Now it's your turn. You can start your talk, start your presentation.
All right. Let me take you out. All right, is that? How's that? Now, does everybody see that okay?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, it's okay. We can hear you,
and you can.
Yeah.
Okay, and you can hear me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk before your group, and I particularly appreciate that that Professors Chew and Singh are able to join us and make comments. This talk is about society and markets as we find them in the work of Adam Smith.
我说这个事情知道谁吗
Okay.
Vernon Smith 02年和卡尼曼同时获得诺贝尔奖的那个经济学家。
Oh, somebody is speaking in the background. You need to mute.
Well,
Well, hi, Vernon. Long time no see.
hi, Chew. Well, I'm having difficulty. It's still echoing.
I can still see your
Are you
slide.
still hearing?
Yeah,
Are you
we're
still
hearing
hearing
you.
an echo?
Yes. No echo. There was somebody else explaining you to somebody else, and didn't mute.
Okay. Well, this talk it's about experiments, but it's about theory that comes from classical economics. And the models of society in the sense of the communities of friends and neighbors, and how it is that friends and neighbors are able to get along with each other, that you find in Adam Smith's first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And so I want to talk about that and give examples of how his propositions apply to trust games. And the other work, of course, of Adam Smith is The Wealth of Nations. And I want to show you how that can be used to develop a model of price discovery in markets, because chapter 7, book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, it provides you a narrative description of how it is that buyers and sellers, when they come to market, are able to discover prices. And this is a very fresh perspective relative to modern sorts of thinking. It's based upon joint work with Inawa on markets and with Bart Wilson on humanomics, as we call it, and that's based upon our book on humanomics. Okay, now Adam Smith's contributions are remarkably fresh and original. That seems amazing after 180 years, but I want to try to convince you that this argument has merit. And so there's two parts to the talk: social theory and market price discovery theory. And I'm going to use Smith's model of social action. I'm going to apply it to trust games to show you how propositions in Adam Smith enables us to explain and predict outcomes in trust games. The interesting thing about this model is that Adam Smith assumes that everybody is strictly self-interested. Now that sounds like a contradiction. If everyone is strictly self-interested, how is it possible that their actions can be other regarding, take into account the situation of other people? Well, Smith accomplished this in a very simple way. He distinguishes being self-interested from choosing to act self-interestedly. So in his model, we're all self-interested, but we learn to follow rules that enable us to live peaceably with our neighbors. And it turns out that these rules all require common knowledge of self-interest. In other words, to implement the rules, you have to really assume that everyone is self-interested. So I think that's a perspective that's fresh. And interestingly, it's able to explain and predict what happened in trust games that we discovered back in the 1980s and 90s, and we're baffled by those results. And then the other thing I want to talk about is Smith's model of price formation. And he's modeling price formation from the perspective and experience of buyers and sellers in the market. And we tend not to do that in modern theorizing. We tend to model what an optimizing agent would do in a market. That needn't be the same as to what the actual buyers and sellers are doing. Adam Smith has a perspective of the participants in the market. So in both books, Smith is modeling what I would call the roots or origins of action. And these origins are in feelings, experience, and coming through experience and reason to know how to act. In other words, we come to actions. So it really is an attempt by Smith to model the subjects that we study in the field of economics. Okay, well, let me begin with social theory. Smith identifies two pillars of society. One he calls beneficence, the other justice. Now, beneficence is about the good things we do with each other in our families, extended families, and our neighborhoods of community. And his model of beneficence underpins what we would call a positive social reciprocity. Okay, now he doesn't use the term justice in Adam Smith's view has to do with limiting and restraining negative reciprocity. So in other words, it's about the bad things, the hurts that we sometimes impose on each other, and how that through punishment, we learn to control that. And that, by the way, becomes the foundations of property. Okay, and that's developed in the theory of moral sentiments. So, and both of these concepts involve what Adam Smith calls self-command. In other words, through self-command, we learn to return the favors of others in our communities and to provide ways of controlling and limiting unjust actions by our friends and neighbors, and that's done through forms of punishment. So in the theory of moral sentiments, the concept of justice is about one and only one thing: security from injury. Okay, see now modern notions of justice have to do with distribution. People talk about distributional justice. That's not justice in Smith. That has to do with beneficence. Okay, distributional, whether the questions of equality of distribution have to do with beneficence in Smith, not justice, because justice is just concerned with one thing, and that's the control and limitation of injury. So when we come to, and that's all developed in his first book. Now, when he comes to the Wealth of Nations, justice is law. Basically, the rule of law is the form which justice takes in modern democratic constitutional governments. And justice as law secures from injury from three sources: from government, from neighbors, and from foreigners. Well, of course, that means citizens first have to have their government under control. Otherwise, the government's not going to help them protect each other from neighbors and from foreigners. So this is why in democratic constitutional Western governments all have constitutions that are concerned with defining the rights of citizens. We have First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and so on, First, Second, and Fifth Amendment, and other rights that basically are concerned with protecting our rights against invasion and invasion and law breaking by the government or rule breaking by the government. So, given once you get government under control, a really large order, then you can talk about how the government can help to protect us from injury by our neighbors and, of course, by foreigners in national programs of defense. So here's Beneficence Proposition 1. It's on page 112 in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's not called a proposition. It's not named Beneficence Proposition 1. That's Bart and I. We call it Beneficence Proposition 1. And Smith just states actions of a beneficent tendency which proceed from proper motives. And there's an explanation later in which he makes it clear that by proper motives, he means intentional. You did something good for me because you wanted to do something good for me, okay? You intended to do it. Those kinds of action, Smith says, seem alone to require reward because such alone are the approved objects of gratitude, okay? And by approved, he's talking about the community. He's talking about third parties, others, see these events taking place and give their stamp of approval to them. So these are community support sorts of rules that we're talking about. I come home from work on Monday, and I forget to bring my trash barrel in. Okay, and if you don't, you get a ticket if you leave it on the street overnight on Mondays because the sweeper comes through. My neighbor brings it in for me. Okay, I may not see my neighbor again until the weekend, and I pick some fruit off of my avocado tree to take to her. Okay, that's an example of the kind of exchange that goes on, you see, every day and without almost even thinking about it between friends and neighbors. And now the obverse of Beneficence Proposition 1, we call Justice Proposition 1. The obverse of that is that actions of a hurtful tendency, which proceed from improper motives, meaning that you hurt me and you intended to, seem alone to deserve punishment because such alone are the approved objects of resentment. So Smith is telling us that the good things we do for each other and our neighbors, among our neighbors, arising from this feelings of gratitude for their actions, and hurtful actions that give rise to punishment arise from resentment. Now, all of these, both of these rules and other discussions in Adam Smith require common knowledge that all are self-interested. Otherwise, you don't know what is benefit and hurt. Notice that to implement these rules, people have to have common knowledge of what a benefit is or what a hurt is. So in this sense, these propositions, to implement them, require people implicitly to assume that all are self-interested. Now, here's a game tree, a trust game, and the main point I want to make here is that everybody analyzes this game in the same way. So if 1 moves down and 2 moves down in response, okay, everyone puts the same construction on that. 1, if 2's moved down, makes 1 worse off. If 1 had not moved down but moved right, he'd have made $12. So the construction is 1 gets less, and therefore 1 is made worse off. 2 gets more. Instead of $12, 2 gets $42 and is made better off. So we all look at that game and analyze it in the same way. Now, if people have social preferences, you can't really conclude this. It may be the case that 1 will be happy to give more to 2 if 2 moves down. Suppose 1 is mother and 2 is son. Okay, mother may be perfectly happy that 2 transfers $12 from 1 to 6. I mean, the payoff drops from 12 to 6, whereas with the second person, the payoff goes up from 12 to 42. So we typically, in analyzing these games, we're really all implicitly assuming that individuals are self-interested. Now, notice here the beneficence proposition 1 is consistent with the trust game choices here. There's 49 pairs, okay, that enter into this 2-person trust game. 27 of the ones play down, that's 55%. Of the ones that play down, 2s play right 2 to 1. So we're having an overwhelming by 2 to 1 rejection of the strict self-interest postulate, where 2s are remarkably, you see, foregoing the $42, taking 30, and giving 1 18. Now, somewhat less than 2/3 of the ones play down, but that's easily understandable because ones are uncertain about who they're paired with. 2s know for sure, since these are played in sequence. 2s know for sure who they're paired with if 1 passes to them. So and if we do variations on this game and asked how these variations might affect people's choices, we're working on the returns to 1 by playing down, and to do that has to overcome, you see, this certainty of playing right. So 1 is always risking, you see, in some sense, ending up worse off. Now, suppose we modify this game and introduce and allow for the possibility that 1 can come back and punish 2 if 2 defects. So now if 1 plays down and 2 plays down, 2 play passes back to 1, and 1 chooses between cooperation and defect. And indeed, we notice here that we have 24% of the ones in the bottom node punishing 2 at a $2 cost to himself. He reduces the payoff of 2 by $38, from $42 to $4. Now you might say, why aren't more people punishing? At a very low cost, you can really you can really slam to for this action? Well, Smith has a proposition on that. He says, above all, the impartial spectator that we use to kind of govern our choice in relationship to others, that's his metaphor for the judgments we make concerning what others think that we're doing. The impartial spectator is above all fair. Okay, he's fair, and in particular, impartial spectators want to see the punishment fit the infraction. So punishment can be neither too large nor too small relative to how people judge the severity of the infraction. So you can see that that proposition in Smith would allow you to explore ways in which this decision down here would be changed if we vary the payoffs, okay? Okay, now the conclusions from this part concerning social theory. Trust gains, we see, in which individuals do not choose best for themselves, collectively do best for all. And secondly, costly options are invoked to punish, that is, deter injustice. Now, interestingly, Smith points out he sees deterrence, the primary dependence on deterrence, as a means of limiting unjust acts, as the policies of a strong central government. He says when governments are not so strong in weak early governments, if my son, suppose my son murders someone, a boy in another family, where governments were weaker, Smith said the concern of the officials was to prevent the outbreak of violence. In other words, to take actions which keep the peace. And therefore, in these cases, the family, the perpetrator of the crime would be brought to the head of the family of the victim of the crime. Okay, and so now we saw in these early societies, punishment was took the form of victim compensation. That's interesting, that victim compensation was often used. If the victim is compensated, that of course punishes, it levies a cost on the perpetrator, but it also enables a peace to be kept, you see, among family hierarchies. And so this, in other words, the earlier weaker governments were concerned more with peacekeeping, the prevention of the outbreak of violence between families. With stronger central governments, you no longer have that tendency to use victim compensation, but you have an exclusive dependence on deterrence. So punishment is the primary, as a deterrence, is the primary weapon used to control unjust actions. Now, let me say something about Justice Proposition 1 as the origin of property. Smith says that the violation of justice is injury, real and positive hurt to persons from motives naturally disapproved of. It is therefore the proper object of resentment and punishment. As the greater and more irreparable the evil that is done, the resentment of the sufferer runs naturally the higher. And of course, the punishments tend to be higher. Now, in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith combines this proposition that I've just stated with the asymmetry of gains and losses to explain why theft and robbery are penalized more than violation of contract. Now, Smith's statement of the asymmetry of gains and losses, which, by the way, he derives from a more fundamental asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. Smith's book is deeply social psychological. It's a really an incredible study in social psychology. It didn't jumpstart a field of psychology. When he wrote The Wealth of Nations, that did a lot to jumpstart the field of economics. So historians of science will have to come up with some explanation of why why his first book didn't have a greater impact on the development of psychology, because psychology really doesn't start to form until well into the century following Adam Smith's first book. So anyway, he's going to explain why theft and robbery are penalized more than violation of contract. So what does Smith say? He says to be deprived of that which we are possessed of is a greater evil than to be disappointed of what we have only the expectation. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery which take from us what we are possessed of are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of what we expect. So he says, the most sacred laws of justice, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions, and last become those which guard what are called his personal rights, or what is due to him from the promises of others. Well, and of course, indeed, today you see violation of property is criminal. Theft and robbery are criminal acts. The same loss in a violation of contract is considered only a civil offense. And a civil offense, the hurt party has a right to be made whole, and you can get a judgment to that effect. But unless there's some sort of fraud in violation of the contract, there's nothing in that violation that's criminal. Okay, so we have these all adjudicated by civil procedures where the rules are not the same as in criminal procedures. Okay, let me now go to part 2 and Smith's model of price discovery as we learn of it in The Wealth of Nations. And this model, by the way, predicts equilibrium convergence that I observed in the first market experiments that I ran. They were published in 1962. But I was ignorant of the sophistication of this model in the Wealth of Nations, and unaware that a properly modern developed version of that theory actually predicted exactly what I observed. Now I want to introduce this topic by asking you to consider that in demand theory, when consumers arrive in markets, how do we as theorists express their demand? Well, there's been two ways. General equilibrium theorists have considered price to be the independent variable, and quantities chosen to be the dependent variable. Marshallian theorists had that turned that around. They considered to be what was given as the desired quantities, and associated this with this market prices. Well, in a sense, both are incorrect. Why? Well, pre-market prices cannot be given because they're not yet found. Okay? Nor can demand be aggregated across individuals. The neoclassical modern procedure was to state that given prices, individuals maximize utility subject to an income stream. And that yielded optimal quantities as functions of prices. The classical perspective, and this sort of began with Adam Smith, but was associated with his French, English, and Italian followers, they saw the function of markets as twofold. Simultaneously, one, to find prices, and second, to aggregate demand and supply in the process, through the process in which these prices are found. Only then can demand and supply relate to the contract prices found. So you can think of people leaving the market, and now they've found the prices, and we can talk about how supply and demand is related to those prices. Now, how did classical economists represent agents, buyers and sellers in consumer markets? Well, first of all, they considered the space to be discrete. Okay, transactions tended to involve single units. They might involve more than a single unit, but often, particularly in consumer markets, these were single units. Think of a shopping basket. When you go to the supermarket, what do you see in your neighbor's shopping basket? A quart of milk, a pound of butter, a jar of olives, a small box of cereal. You have in your shopping basket a half gallon of milk, a pound of bacon, a large jar of olives, and a large box of cereal. Now, so people typically are not buying multiple units. And the reason is, in consumer markets, because markets are solving an inventory problem for consumers. Okay? So depending upon your family size, your frequency of shopping, and how much cupboard space you have in your kitchen, you buy small, medium, or large packages of goods in the grocery store. And I like to think of those packages as being governed by solving an inventory problem for consumers. So buyers' value for each unit can be measured by the maximum amount of money each is willing to pay or give up. And this is how if you read Adam Smith, chapter 7, that's the way he is conceptualizing demand. So in the aggregate, think of Q buyers defined by a negative distribution function of values, V equal D of Q. So that's a distribution function. Sellers each have minimum willingnesses to accept, WTA, and as a distribution function of costs. Think of that as C equal S of Q. So those are distribution functions. D is non-increasing, and that comes from the order property of a distribution function, not diminishing marginal utility. You see, These are properties of the distribution function. They have nothing to do with diminishing marginal utility. And which is where with continuous commodity spaces, the neoclassics, you see, argue that people bought units up to the point where the last dollar spent on good one was equal to the last dollar spent for good two, and those involve multiple units. Well, classical economists tended to model much closer to observation, to what they were seeing there in markets. Okay, now, see, Marshall's thinking was right, but his math error was in replacing V and C with P. And in fact, read Marshall has a great description of price formation in a local country corn market. And that description is entirely about buyers with willingness to pay, sellers with willingness to accept reservation costs, and it's about the higgling and bargaining that goes on in that market to produce prices. So in these prices can't legitimately appear in these distribution functions because P has not yet been found in the market by some market price formation process. Now, interestingly, you see, if modern game theorists, when they model auctions, they don't model auctions this way. They begin with distributions of values. And then they ask how from that distribution of values, prices are formed. Okay, so in modern auction theory, kind of departs from the way we traditionally think of supply and demand markets working. So all we're doing here, all that my co-author Inouye are doing, is looking at supply and demand markets from the perspective of distributions of values and costs. So think of the causal sequence in which buyers and sellers arrive in markets and they bring with them in the aggregate probability distribution functions of private buyers' willingness to pay values. And that's all private information. Similarly, sellers, the supply side, sellers are arriving with distributions of willingness to accept, minimum they're willing to accept. So think of demand as being V equal D of Q, supply being C equal S of Q. Now, conditionally, of course, we could write P equals D of Q, providing we specify that P is separating all the higher values from the lower values, and the buyers are only the people with the higher values. And similarly, price is dividing the set of supply costs between the low values that are profitable and the high values that are not profitable. So this editing is think of these supply and demand distribution functions as involving values and costs, and then with buyers, each buyer trying to buy cheap and each seller trying to sell dear, we have a process that is generating prices out of the conjunction of those supply and demand schedules. And then what happens in the market is that prices form, and now prices are advertised or published that have to do with corresponding contracts for these transferred quantities. Now, specifically, you see the market price might be a multiple unit English auction, say for 2 units. And I'm going to show you an example like that later. But examples of this general model all involve specific rules governing how buyers and sellers meet and interact and form prices. okay? And then out of that process, buyers and sellers leave the market and they've got quantities bought and sold as a function of the price found. So we can talk about the quantity taken from the market being determined by the price found, the supply being determined by the price found, and so on. Well, here's my first experiment, and this is in January 1956. And here is the first experiment I report in the 1962 paper. Notice I'm following convention here, and I'm saying price is on the vertical axis. Well, price is not on the vertical axis. What we have here is a distribution of values, a linear distribution of values, and a linear distribution of supply costs. That's the content. That's what's arrived in the market. Okay, and what I did, I had 11 buyers and 11 sellers. I gave each buyer a private value with the understanding that if he bought at a price P lower than that value, he would earn an amount of money equal to his private value less the price he pays in the market to some seller. So every buyer is motivated to buy low. Sellers are each given a private, and think of that as a willingness to accept lower bound cost. And that seller is going to be able to earn the difference between the price at which he or she sells and the cost that's been supplied to him privately. So that's the information in the market, and that's exactly as we will see more specifically out of chapter 7 of the Wealth of Nations. On the right, we have the prices being formed, and the institution here was the oral outcry two-sided auction, and these are the prices generated in the first period, and then we replenish the supply and demand for the second period and another series of prices. So the found prices are happening over here on the right side. Now, I was astounded that this market converged so easily and so quickly. And I want to emphasize that no one circa 1956, who had taken courses in graduate economic theory, no one, either taking the courses or teaching them, would have believed that 22 sophomores could walk into a room, you could make 11 of them buyers, 11 of them sellers, give them this information, let them trade by oral outcry auction, and you would get that, and that they would find the equilibrium of that market almost immediately. No one would believe that. And in fact, I didn't believe it. I thought, this can't be true. What's wrong with the experiment? Well, too much symmetry. Just a very special case. Look, the clearing price is the average demand value equal to the average cost of the sellers. The demand is a mirror image of the supply. There's too much symmetry in here. So that surely is the problem in this market. Well, I'll come back to that and show you how I disabused myself of any idea that there was anything wrong with that experiment. Here's a more recent experiment. These are high school students. And you'll see here over on the right, there's 6 buyers and 6 sellers. And the instructor who is conducting this experiment has an assistant who is typing in all the bids and asks as they're announced from the floor from these buyers and sellers, and also the acceptances when a contract occurs. So here's the bids, here's the ass leading up to this first contract, then the second. So all the data in the market, you see, is being displayed to the people who are making the market. All that values and costs behind this market is private information and is not displayed. Now, since this is a teaching exercise, of course, what we want to do is show where those come from. So here is the array of buyers' values and of sellers' costs that generated that series of price outcomes. The market's 100% efficient. Notice that only these 12 lowest cost sellers make sales, and it is to the 12 highest priced, highest willingness to pay value buyers. And that's a very common outcome. Now, here's another early experiment in which I thought the problem on that first one was there was too much symmetry. So a lot of my early experiments were really looking at basic issues like, is this explained by too much symmetry? Well, it wasn't. Here's a highly asymmetric supply and demand case in which it only takes about 3 or 4 periods in that market is home. Okay. Okay, now let me go back to Adam Smith and more specifically to chapter 7. Now, he saw goods as have value in use. They had utility in use, but utility is a hidden and unmeasurable variable. And so he saw that he measured value, buyer value in terms of willingness to pay. Okay, he thought of buyers coming to market with these reservation values. Also, that these markets involved a lot of discreteness, where consumers were buying only 1 or 2 units. Okay. Now, on the other hand, price represents value in exchange, and he saw that as depending upon competitive entry. So it was entry competition of both buyers and sellers that really determined price. And he points out that there is no entry competition in the diamond market because there's only one source of supply. On the other hand, other goods like water, old iron, scrap iron, there are many producer entrants, and so that the contestability of that market by these other sellers is very much determine the prices that come out of the market. And then what's the market dynamics? Well, Smith argues that if the quantity brought to market, he says, falls short of effectual demand, those willing to pay the supply price cannot all be supplied. Some will bid for what they can get, and the price will increase. Notice here he's saying that if little is brought to market, purchases are limited by the supply offered, and price tends to rise. So there's two conditions in there. There's a limitation. Purchases are constrained by supply, and price tends to rise. On the other hand, if the quantity brought to market exceeds the demand, it can all be sold to buyers willing to pay the supply price, and price falls. So if too much is there, sales are limited by demand and price tends to fall. So what's the theory in this narrative of the market and the wealth of nations? Well, first, price change has the same sign as excess demand. That's the first mathematical statement we can say. And secondly, at any price, the contracted quantity is limited by the minimum of amount demanded or supplied. So here's let me go through here the mathematical version of this that comes out of chapter 7. In the first place, what's the motivation? Well, buyers have these willingness to pay values and sellers' willingness to accept costs. Buyers are in there to buy cheap, sellers to sell dear. And by the way, Smith knew about auctions. Nowhere does he tell you about it. Does he write down a theory of auctions or develop it fully? But every once in a while, he makes a comment that involves auctions. For example, he points out that if two people desire an antique book equally, the one with the larger wealth will carry it. All right, that statement tells you that Adam Smith was aware that the highest bidder is the person who wins in an English auction, and that both tastes and wealth matter. So he says if the tastes are the same, then wealth is going to make the difference. So he has an operational understanding of auctions, and from time to time refers to them to make a point. Okay, what's the price adjustment rule? Well, the price change and excess demand have the same sign. So E of P to PDT is positive, okay, if the excess demand is not zero. So price moves in opposite direction to the excess demand. Suppose we write V of P, and actually I did this in my 1962 article. But in 1962, I didn't begin to understand the full ramifications of this. But I was looking at the data empirically, and I was asking whether the Walrasian notion of excess demand or the Marshallian notion that demand price be above or below the supply price, whether those could help you to understand the dynamics of equilibration. And empirically, it looked to me like that neither of those worked nearly as well as simply the integral of excess supply. And think of that as the profit required to maintain any given price in the market. And notice that dVdt is just the excess supply times dPdP, and that is non-increasing. So V of T here is non-increasing. Think of V of P as a measure in profit space of the distance of price from traders' values and costs. You can, and then there's also the short side rationing. And if you think of V of P as being constrained by short side rationing, we then can define total surplus as simply the intersection of the profitable values that buyers bring to market and the profitable costs that sellers bring to market. So in other words, if we edit the distributions at some price so that we're only taking the highest value buyers and the lowest cost sellers, and they will behave, of course, to give us that result, then we have this total surplus. So that this is the profit realized in the market. So think of this as the overall weighted distance between price and the trader's valuations. Well, V here is a Lyapunov function, And it has properties that predict that it converges to the center, what we call the center of value of the market, P star. What's the center of value? It's where price no longer changes. Okay. Markets may or may not clear when you get there. I mean, think of a constant cost industry with perfectly elastic supply. Okay, the amount sold is determined by demand, where demand crosses that elastic supply function. So there may be excess supply or demand at a stationary equilibrium. Well, we call this the principle of maximum information. That market price evolves so as to reflect across transactions, it reflects value better and better. Okay. This you see brings this perspective to bear on the more modern one of Hayek and also Hurwitz, Ryder, and Radner on informational efficiency. And I'm going to show you specifically how we use Shannon's definition of information to get a quantitative measure of information in a supply and demand market. But first, here's an illustration of these functions. Here's a exponential distribution of demand, an exponential distribution of supply. Here is the amount traded. If price is too low, the amount traded is limited by supply, not demand. If price is too high, then the amount traded is limited by demand, not supply. So this is the kind of the way to characterize trade quantities. Over here, here's the V of P function, which reaches a minimum at the center of market value. And then overall surplus, actually collected by buyers and sellers, is increasing to a maximum in here. And here's prices eroding toward over successive transactions toward the center of value. Okay, here's some information theory from Shannon. Now notice that a transaction concluded at some price P reveals publicly the existence of a seller with cost C less than that price and a buyer with value V no smaller than that price, where C and V, you see, are private information now publicized by the price that's bisecting them somewhere. Okay? So the trade is the conjunction of these two events. Think of V as measuring value added to society. C measures resource value foregone or used up by society in order to produce that value. So hence we have a net gain, and the trade informationally signals that gain, okay, that gain for society. Now Shannon in 1948 proposed measuring the information in an event realization as the log probability of the event. So events reduce uncertainty and provide information, publicize information. And that's his concept, you see, of measuring information. And so if we think of the change in information, to think of information now as the function of price in a market, the change in information then and think of a smooth large market where everything is differentiable, then the change in information with price is just the log ratio of D of P to S of P, because that ratio of demand to supply, you see, is giving you the ratio of the high values sorted out at the price P and matched with the low cost sellers' values sorted out at the price P. Because sellers are not going to sell at a loss, buyers are not going to buy at a loss. So that becomes a means of measuring that information. So the change in transaction information with a change in P is non-negative. We can write here di dt as that log d over s dp dt, and that is non-negative. Here's the integral, which is more clumsy to deal with, so I'm only mostly talking about the changes. Okay, now notice that this generalization of the classical model of price discovery is parameter free. We haven't really put any structure yet on the market, any structure that governs how the specific way in which buyers meet sellers and make trades. And that, of course, is something we study when we look at the institutions of markets. Institutions provide more detailed rule structure on how it is that buyers and sellers interact to determine particular outcomes. And I'm going to give you an example here of the multiple unit English auction where Q equals 4, and also shows you how the double auction fits into this framework. Well, suppose 4 units are being traded in a multiple unit English auction. Well, here's the reservation values of the buyers arrayed from highest to lowest. And we had 4 units that sellers are willing to supply at this price or higher. Now, in the Vickrey form of this auction, he sees, and then the multiple unit auction, there's a first bid on the floor, which is, say, down here around 10. And in Bill Vickrey's version of the multiple unit auction, as soon as you have 3 matches to that first bid, then someone can bid a higher price. And then you get 3 matches and someone can bid a higher price. So the market marches up until it stops somewhere between the 4th highest value and the 5th highest value. Okay, so in here are these prices going up and then stabilize at the center. Okay, and here's the BFP function, and these are linear planar segments of that function. And here's I of P, Shannon's information representation of that market. So B of P is minimized while I of P is maximized. If you look at the double auction, it has parameters such as bids and asks. Buyers are making bids, sellers are announcing asks, and we can calculate the rate of information flow with the flow of bids and asks. So the flow of information from the bid side is just log d of b db dt. The flow of information from the ask side are so bids are rising. Buyers are bidding more aggressively over time to try to get units. Sellers are reducing their asking prices, and we can talk about the flow of it because each of those revelations is giving information to the market. On the other hand, this valuation function now can be written as a function of the parameters A and B. We integrate over the supply up to A and of demand from B up to the higher values. So in conclusions, markets regulated, remember, by property. You can't steal, okay? If you take something, you have to pay for it. And if you give something, you are compensated when you give it, okay? And based upon private information in which people try only to do best for themselves, collectively do best for everybody. That's the basic theorem. And the wealth of nations. And he implements that with a discussion of how prices which regulate how the types of specialization activities that people engage in. He shows how those prices are formed. So it collectively do best for all. That means in this representation that V of P is minimized, I of P is maximized at the center of value P star. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This summary is basically what I started with. And let me point out that you can download both of Adam Smith's book free of charge at these sites. So I urge you to read the originals, not listen to me. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Vernon Smith. It's such a wonderful and extremely insightful talk. It covers a wide range of content from Adam Smith's classics to information theory. So now we'll have I think because of the limit of time, we'll have a brief discussion panel. Professor Ding Yifan from Hainan Green Finance Research Institute and Professor Chew SooHong from Southern Western University of Economics and Finance will join the discussion. No, it's just
sorry, interrupting you. I just wonder, shouldn't you open the floor to a few questions and answers?
The Q&A session is in the last session, but we can, the audience can hold the question, or then in the last session, 5 to 10 minutes, they can ask the three experts. Of course, in the discussion panel, if you have questions for Professor Vernon Smith, you can discuss. That's it.
Yeah, or I might add comments or directions in which this might be taken. You know, Sabu, Anawa, and I are early in this work, and I'm sure there are errors to be corrected and extensions to be made. Okay.
Professor Ding or Professor Chew, you can open your video and microphone.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay.